But Nick, what the hell, man? These Cowboys, we see, we see Jonathan Hankins, who has been a big time middle of that defense, interior defensive player for these Cowboys. He also makes his way away from Dallas as he's expected to sign with the Seahawks. Like, what does it feel like the expectation is for the interior of this defense, Mike Zimmer's now new defense, with Hankins on his way out?
Yeah, it's got to be tough watching Hankins walk out the door. I mean, especially seeing him play on the veteran minimum over the course of these last two seasons.
Yeah, like $1 million, right? Like $1 million, a little over $1 million?
Exactly. And so you have an expectation that you should be able to work some things around even with the limited cap space, because you saw how valuable he was to your defensive line last year. But in the same sense, Aiden Dirty also saw how valuable he was to that defensive line last year, and now he's a defensive coordinator for the Seahawks.
That's right.
They needed to fill a space there at that one tech position, a big guy that could play next to Leonard Williams. And Aiden Dirty said, "Hey, I know a guy down in Dallas that I just had for a couple of years." And sure enough, they make the call, and Hankins ends up in Seattle. And it's a good fit for Hankins. But you look at it from the Cowboys' perspective, absolutely, that defensive tackle position all of a sudden is really thin. Neville Gallimore went to the Dolphins last week. The only reliable body that you feel like you have there is Mozzie Smith, but how confident are you in him going into year two? After a year one that was mainly down, there was a couple of ups. I think there was an opportunity for him early in the season to get some pass rush going whenever he was able to rotate in with Hankins, and both of those guys were healthy. But as the season went on, he lost some weight. It looked like he dipped even below 300 pounds from my eye test. And so going into year two, it's really important for him to be able to maintain a solid weight at 325 plus. But also, you're looking at the draft class, you're looking at available free agents. You probably need to add two more bodies there in the defensive interior before the offseason's over with.
Hey, Nick, thanks for connecting those dots to Aiden Dirty and Jonathan Hankins. It's like, damn, that's right. It's kind of like some of these guys running off to DQ and Washington. With that being said, let's stick with the defense. Today they released the name of all the coaches and the new hires. Can you tell us more about actually, I mean, it's not long overdue. It's like it should have happened a couple of weeks ago. They named Al Harris assistant head coach. I mean, they couldn't necessarily name him the defensive coordinator because they brought in Zim. Can you talk about that particular move right there? Because this guy has been working hard with the Cowboys since 2020 when he came in with Mike McCarthy.
Yeah, and he's been working hand in hand with Mike McCarthy, even though they are on two completely different sides of the ball. Those are two guys that come together quite often. I mean, obviously, Al played for Mike way back in his days in Green Bay. So those guys have a pre-existing relationship. But I think this title, being able to add that to Al Harris's resume, it's just a show of confidence. And not only the Cowboys, but in Mike McCarthy and what he has done over the course of the last 3 years. I mean, you look at that secondary room. Granted, they were able to bring in a former defensive player of the year in Stephon Gilmore last year, but whenever Trayvon Diggs goes down, he has Deron Bland ready to go, and he plays to a first-team All-Pro level. Let's look in a couple of seasons before that when Trayvon Diggs had his 11 interceptions and what he was able to do and develop Trayvon Diggs in only his second year in the league. So every single year, these DBs have been just a little bit better. The safety group is always really intertwined into the game plan, whether there's two or three on the field at a time. You see young guys like Wanye Thomas, Marquise Bell being able to step into the spotlight whenever those guys are asked to do so. You got to credit that to Al Harris, and that's really good coaching from him. He's really loved in the locker room. Players loved him. I know they were kind of teetering back and forth and wondering if he was going to end up as Dan Quinn's defensive coordinator in Washington or if he was going to end up as a defensive coordinator at another spot. But being able to keep him in Dallas and give him this title, it helps both sides for sure. It's very deserving for Al, one of the best people in the building that you can find, and he works hard at his craft. You see him in that building every single day from sun up to sundown. No doubt.
I know they gave him a raise with that title, but do you know if they extended the contract? I understand all the coaches and that cap room only have 1-year deals. You might not know that information, but have you heard?
Yeah, I don't have that immediate information now. Not all of the assistants are on 1-year deals. There are a few that are extended out a couple of more years, but yeah, for the most part, you're looking at 1-year deals for a lot of this coaching staff. You talk about the meat of the coaching staff: Mike McCarthy, Mike Zimmer. Those are the guys that are on those 1-year deals.
We're talking to Nick Harris of DallasCowboys.com here on 105 Through the Fan. And Nick, I want to return to, the ways in which there are gaps on this team. It's understandable, and I think we all understand the MO of this organization for the most part, that they kind of let go of that first week. But as you mentioned, there's probably a couple of bodies necessary in the interior of the defensive line. We know linebacker still needs to be addressed in some ways. Running back probably. Offensive line, there's a couple of spots. And it just feels like there's not there's not enough draft picks to go around, if you know what I mean. And so with that being the case, like, it does feel like some of this is, fans and all of us on the outside getting a little anxious, but it feels like they've in some ways punted on free agency. Why is that fair or unfair, that feeling that maybe they've just kind of punted on the idea of free agency entirely?
Yeah, I think it is fair. I mean, when you look at the cap situation, the front office knew what they were dealing with well before free agency started. I mean, they had an idea of the kind of money that they would be able to spend on being able to acquire talent. And you look at what Eric Kendricks, Jordan Lewis, Rico Dowdle, all those guys, you look at those contracts and see what they were signed for. 1-year deals that were not a lot of money. And so they knew the kind of guys that they were going to have to be able to go after here in free agency to at least be quote unquote competitive. But I think there's a lot of trust that's going to be put into the scouting department going into April. You mentioned the draft picks. There's only 7, which, if you think about it, there's 7 rounds. That's not too bad. But when you go into this specific offseason with the needs that need to be addressed, you feel like you need 1 or 2 more. And I think being able to trade back potentially in the first round and pick up an extra pick in the 3rd or 4th round, I think that's going to become even more imperative as these days go on and these holes continue to be there and needing to be addressed. The Cowboys always talk about wanting to be in a position where they can take best player available whenever it's their time to pick. They can't do that right now. I mean, unless they have an opportunity where every single position is a position of need. But until then, they can't really do that. They're going to have to take offensive line, probably 2 offensive linemen in the first 2 days of the draft to be able to fill holes at left tackle and center. Granted, they feel confident about Brock Hoffman and TJ Bass being able to step in and compete for that center position. But at the left tackle position, you're going to have to bring in a young guy that can be able to work next to Tyler Smith, or a left guard that can push Tyler Smith out to left tackle. There's a lot of questions that are going to have to be asked in that draft room.
I do want to follow up there on the idea of TJ Bass, Brock Hoffman. I understand that they feel confident there, but that interior of an offensive line is super important, particularly when we talk about quarterback stepping up into the pocket, and then also like for the run game, where I think that did not necessarily help you in the last season. I mean, how confident do you, Nick Harris, feel about the idea of Brock Hoffman or TJ Bass stepping in and giving you average to above average play at that center position?
I'll say this about both of those guys. Both of those guys they are people that I have seen in the facility every single day since the offseason has come through. I mean, you probably only see about 10 guys on a regular basis. Most of these guys are either outside training or they're with their families working at their own homes. But those 2 guys I see in the facility quite a bit, and they've really taken it upon themselves to be able to master their craft this offseason and be able to compete for a position. I was able to talk to Brock Hoffman last week a little bit, and he said, "Look, man, I'm ready to go. I'm doing everything I have to do to be able to show this organization that when Oxnard does come around, I can at least compete for that spot." For me personally, if what I was to do in this situation, I would look at those 2 guys and be like, hey, you have just as much of an opportunity to start at that position as a rookie that we're going to bring in and help compete with you. And I think you give those 3 guys an opportunity to be able to start at that center position, and you go with the best fit. But you look at what those 2 guys did last year whenever they were asked to step into starting positions. I mean, you look at Brock Hoffman, week 18 against Washington. Granted, it wasn't in a game that really mattered in the grand scheme of things. Probably not, but he found out only about 60 minutes before kickoff that he would be starting at right guard. He hadn't had any reps at right guard since college, and he was able to slide in there and played a great game there on the right side, was able to help facilitate the run game, and he did a fantastic job. So you look at TJ Bass, he's probably the best rookie in the class last year if you look at it from an overall perspective. They have a lot of trust in both of those guys to be able to slide in and compete for that job once training camp does come around.
Let's talk about the running game. They re-signed Rico Dowdle. You got Deuce Vaughn, who's kind of small. I think he's a situational guy if he ever gets off the practice squad because he doesn't play special teams. With that being said, it appears at this point, with all the big names being signed, that they're going to look into the draft for a running back. Could you name a couple of names that you think would fit behind Dak Prescott in this Cowboys offensive line?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a couple of guys even that would work with Rico Dowdle, re-signing him this week and bringing him back. He's the leading returning rusher with 361 yards last year. So a couple of guys that I think could work. I think you could go in 2 different directions whenever you're looking at Rico Dowdle and a guy that can complement him. You could go and get a bigger back that can complement his his athletic ability and his ability to kind of get outside at times and be able to kind of be the bruiser on the outside, or you can get a more athletic back that's more active in the receiving game to be able to throw some situations in on second down or on those first and second and long situations to be able to get the receiving game going. So a couple of guys I really like, a big body type running back, Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin. He's a big dude, 237 pounds, 6'2". You see that at his production of the University of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has obviously put out some great backs over the course of the last decade. Melvin Gordon, Jonathan Taylor, just to name a couple. And looking at a couple of other options, Trey Benson out of Florida State. That's probably the most complete running back that you could look at that is healthy going into this draft process. I say that with the caveat that I think Jonathan Brooks out of Texas is the best running back in this class, but he's dealing with the ACL injury that he suffered against TCU in November. Now, the doctor that did his ACL surgery is the Cowboys team doctor, Dr. Dan Cooper. He did that surgery for him, and so the Cowboys have more medical information on him than anyone else. Reports are that he will be ready to go by training camp for whatever team does draft him. So potentially a running back coming up Interstate 35 to play for the Cowboys next year. But I think regardless, they are going to have to spend a day 2 pick on that position, bring a young guy into that room that'll play on a rookie contract for 4 years and really develop that guy with an opportunity to start in a prominent role next year.
We're talking to Nick Harris, DallasCowboys.com. And Nick, before we let you go, I do want to ask this. I know that you were privileged enough to go to Indy for the Combine. I don't know how deep you get into the draft, so you can pick one of these two questions here. You know, what insights, what was your favorite insight that you got in your time in Indy? And then also, do you have a pet cat, one of these players that you've kind of just really gravitated to as you watch them?
And is your pet cat Will McClay's pet cat?
I see where you're going there, Chris.
Yeah.
As far as pet cats go, man, there's a couple. There's a few that I really have just started to like as more and more as this draft process has gone on. I really like Peyton Wilson, the linebacker out of North Carolina State. He's the Dick Butkus Award winner for the Wolfpack last season, being the nation's top linebacker. He's athletic as can be. He ran the top 40-yard dash for all linebackers at the Combine. Now, granted, he's dealing with injuries that have come out of his college career. He's had 2 major knee surgeries, a major shoulder surgery, but he's been healthy these last 2 years. If the Cowboys are comfortable with how those medicals came out in Indianapolis, I think that would be a great fit on this Cowboys defense, playing alongside DeMarvion Overshown, Damone Clark, and even Eric Kendricks this next season. Gives them that opportunity to kind of flow around with those guys. And I'll give you a guy on the offensive side of the ball, and I'll stay away from running back since we touched on that a little bit. I'll go with Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. A few years back, we saw a similar type of weapon come out for the Gamecocks and Deebo Samuel in a role that they used him inside. They used him outside. They brought him out of the backfield. And whenever you look at Xavier Legette, you see that same usage. And you also see those same thighs. He's got the same thighs as Deebo Samuel did a few years back, and he's able to take on those brute hits. 6'1", 223. So he's really a load there that he can be an offensive weapon. But he's also a guy that could take a ball across the middle of the field and take off. He's got some speed too. He didn't have a great Senior Bowl, but he improved his stock at the Combine. I think he's probably a guy that'll be sitting there in the 3rd or 4th round.
I like that pet cat.
Nick Harris, DallasCowboys.com. Appreciate you so much for giving us a little bit of time. And I guess go Mean Green. I guess I can give this to you in that way.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. There you go.
Appreciate you giving us a little time.
Got to pull for local.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.